Hi everyone, my name is Matthew Mori, and today, Group 1 will be introducing and discussing the sociological approach to biblical prophets. The prophets that we'll be discussing today will be Moses, Hosea, and Deborah. So, what is the sociological approach to biblical readings, or in this case, prophets? Well, let me tell you. The sociological approach is the analysis of the certain status quos and roles of social groups within the time periods portrayed throughout the Bible and are often compared to the current era today. For example, a representation of a sociological norm would be gender roles throughout the Old Testament, how the roles of women were different to the roles of a slave or to a prophet in this case. We analyze the power dynamics between classes and the power of leaders compared to prophets as well. There are many different dynamics in this instance, and the sociological approach is a perfect way to compare how things were different in society and how things were similar. It's very interesting because throughout this, we get to see the many similarities that might still be consistent today in terms of sociological observation. Anyway, enjoy, and let's learn about the sociological approach to biblical analysis. Woo!
So just to give a brief overview of what prophets are before we get into it. Prophets are widely known as intermediaries between divinity and humanity, so in this case between God and his people. Prophets are specifically in Christianity chosen and called by God to do certain things for him. So this could be anything from revealing the nature of God to humanity, showing the law that God is made for his people, calling them back into obedience if they have strayed away, encouraging sincere worship, if some other stuff like that is going on. Also foretelling future events or the coming of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. So in the Bible, they can also be used to lead people and protect them as well. For example, Moses talking to Pharaoh and leading the Israelites out of Egypt or calling the plagues on them. It is widely known that Abraham is the first prophet in the Bible to have these traits, but there are also some other people in the Bible who possess these traits that aren't necessarily considered prophets, but have prophetic qualities, so there is that. Then also, just before we get into it, there's also the notion of false prophets that exist who do these things, but not in the same genuine intent that the actual prophets have. So they will say that they are coming from God, but in reality, they're just making it up for fame or whatever, which is not really the case with actual prophets.
The story of Moses begins with the Israelites being slaves to the Egyptians, and one day the Pharaoh orders for the firstborn sons of the Israelite people to be killed. So Jochebed, Moses' mother, sends baby Moses down the river in a basket where the Queen of Egypt picks him up and raises him as her own. So eventually, when Moses grows up, he finds out that he's Israelite, so he leaves. He travels the desert to a place called Midian, and there is where he starts to have a family. And then one day he sees a burning bush talking to him, and that burning bush is God, and he tells him, Moses, you need to go back to Egypt to save our people. So Moses goes back to Egypt to save the people, but the Pharaoh doesn't believe in his God. So when Moses tries to convince him to free the people because that's what his God said, the Pharaoh is like, no, I'm not going to let that happen. So God brings about 10 plagues, and one of the plagues is to kill the firstborn son of the Egyptians are going to die. So the Pharaoh's son dies, and Moses and his people leave, and they leave through the desert. And eventually they reach the Red Sea, and they don't know how they're going to pass it. So the Egyptians start chasing after them, and God tells them, don't worry, just rest tonight, and tomorrow you'll walk on dry land. So the Egyptians are coming still, and Moses raises his staff the next day, and the sea parts. So the Israelites start walking through the Red Sea, and the Egyptians are chasing behind them. And then the Israelites end up getting out of the Red Sea, and the Egyptians are still following behind them, but they're still in the Red Sea. So God brings down the water to get rid of the Egyptians. And then the Israelites start walking through the Sinai desert, and eventually they reach Mount Sinai, where God tells Moses his laws for the people, and that leads to the 10 Commandments.
So when we look at Moses through the sociological approach, we can see he had a lot of influence on the social dynamics of his day and his people. He was able to lead the Hebrews out of slavery in Egypt, and he was able to do so because he had a lot of influence with the Pharaoh, because he was raised in the palace by his daughter, the princess, which is really cool. So that way he was able to do so. And a modern day example to Moses can be Harriet Tubman. Her nickname was actually Moses during the Civil War era because she led lots of people to freedom who were once slaves, which is really cool to think about and maybe talk about in your groups. And then also Moses was a mediator of the covenant between God and the people. God was the one who gave Moses the 10 Commandments, and Moses was able to mediate that to the people and lead them, and ultimately lead them to the promised land that God had told them he was going to give them. And so Moses acted as a liberator and an establisher in a political sense. So,
how y'all doing? The second prophet will be Hosea. He is a citizen of the northern kingdom, and at that time it was just called Israel, that northern kingdom. He gave his message before the fall of Samaria around 722 BCE. So Hosea is a lot different from the other prophets, and I'll tell you why after all of this. So Hosea was told by God to marry a prostitute named Gomer and have 3 kids with her. The first was a son, and his name was Jezreel, which means judgment is coming. The second was a daughter, and her name was Lo Ruhamah, which means not loved. The third was a son, and his name was Lo Ami, which means not my people. So Gomer, after all this, runs away and goes back into a life of prostitution, which leaves Hosea obviously disappointed and wrecked. She finds a bunch of lovers. She is like just enjoying the company of all of them, and while she's doing this, Hosea is leaving gifts for her whenever she comes back every night to the house, and he leaves gifts for her like wine, wool and linen, gold and silver, olive oil, all these different things for her to enjoy, for her to come back. And so Gomer, she takes them not even knowing it's from Hosea, and she thinks it's from her lovers, and she takes them and sacrifices it to the god Baal. So after all this, God tells Hosea to reconcile his relationship with his wife, and he takes some money and goes and buys her out of prostitution to take her back, not as a slave, but as his wife again, to be in flesh again. And so she comes back and becomes the mother of the children again, and they become a family once again. So this is all a metaphor for Hosea and Gomer. It's all a metaphor for the nation of Israel and God and how their relationship goes. And it's basically all a message of God's love and a message of redemption of the nation of Israel. And the same thing with Gomer, how she was bought back, and how the love of Hosea was unwavering, the same how the love of God is unwavering to the nation of Israel. And it's a lot and Hosea is a lot different because the way he teaches, he doesn't just teach from his words, but he also teaches with his life, his choice of the choice he made with his wife and everything. So thank you,
everyone. So I'm introducing the power dynamics that were taking place during the period that the book of Hosea speaks about. Pretty complicated situation. We have the divide of the northern and southern kingdom after Solomon, and Hosea is writing around the period of the second half of the 8th century BC, so from about 750 to the turn of that century, maybe a little after. Anyway, we have the northern kingdom was really volatile. Some scholars have said from about 850 to 7 BC, over about 100 years, that northern kingdom enjoyed quite a bit of prosperity and political peace, but it was after that we get a lot of dynastic shifts. There was a lot of intrigue politically going on over the 30 years from about 750 to 720. there are 4 dynastic changes, and 4 of the 6 kings that ruled during that time were assassinated and the throne usurped and replaced by another ruling family or dynasty. So pretty crazy things going on up there. Southern Kingdom, a bit more stable as far as like monarchical succession of powers. However, with Uzziah or Azariah, he usurps a lot of the power and position of the priesthood. So one of the main power struggles that was always at tension in Israel was between the priesthood and the monarchy. So a lot going on there. And then it looks as though different cults and idolatry and worship of various gods were being introduced in the southern kingdom, which of course would have caused all kinds of turmoil. I'm sure some would have enjoyed that, some definitely would not have. So major source of conflict going on there. The prophets are interesting characters, and we hear a lot the distinction between true and false prophets. What it looks like is when we're speaking of true prophets is they were their source of power was really they spoke truth to those in power. So they would deliver messages. However, we think that they received those messages. What they were doing was approaching the leadership, be that in the priesthood or the royalty, and challenging them, calling them out on injustices, abuse of power, mixing and mingling with, making treaties with other nations that they weren't supposed to. So prophets, priests, and kings are usually the categories that you hear about when talking about power within Israel, and the 3 of those considered together were where the main power struggles and dynamics existed within ancient Israel. So we can definitely take some questions from here.
So for my topic, I chose the gender roles of Hosea. I found a lot of parallels in Hosea to Genesis. Genesis 3:16, some people see it as talking about how the woman is supposed to provide pleasure and children for her husband. Hosea and Genesis kind of have this, they have a very similar marriage model that begins in betrayal. In Hosea, the woman is portrayed as this bad, adulterous prostitute, and it's almost like in the sense when she gets married, she is saved by the man.
And Deborah's role in these 2 chapters alone is confirming God's command to a man named Barak to assemble a troop to go against and to defeat the army of Jabin, which was the current oppressor of Israel at the time. And not only that, but she participated in it, and we just thought her story was really interesting because her and another female character named Jael just had a strong influence and impact in the just direction of history being made, of Israel's history. And it's kind of interesting because it's only in 2 chapters that she's really mentioned, but in these 2 chapters of the Bible, it's just so much action and agency actually for a female character, which isn't always the case in the Bible, but I will leave that to my friend Ya to further discuss.
The story of Deborah is a great example when talking about gender roles. Not only was she a judge, but she was also a prophet in Israel during a time of oppression. Typically, women are just seen as mothers, wives, and daughters, and nothing more. However, Deborah's flipped the script on typical gender roles in Judges chapters 4 and 5. Around this time, scholars say that the men were not up to par and they were weak-willed, so God decided to put a woman in charge partly to shame the men. If you look at Judges chapter 4, verses 6 through 9, you can see that the way that the men were acting and the reason why Deborah had to step up in the position. Barak asks Deborah if she can go with him, and if she does not go with him, then he will not go. And her response is, certainly I will go. And because you are acting this way, victory will be in the hands of a woman. So not only does Deborah know that the reason why she's put in this position is because the men are not able to uphold, she willingly steps up to the plate to take control. In Judges chapters 4 In chapters 5, however, you kind of see Deborah being put back into that same gender role typical box that women normally are in. In Judges chapter 4, verse 4, Deborah's husband is mentioned when she is introduced, saying Deborah is a prophet, wife of, and was leading. So putting wife of in there kind of boxes Deborah back into the typical feminine gender role that is seen throughout the Bible. And the same thing in Judges chapter 5, verse 7, when it mentions that Deborah is the mother of Israel.